Ladies and gentlemen, today we journey through a story not just of a nation, but of a dream. A dream powerful enough to ignite revolutions, inspire generations, and stretch across oceans. This is not just history, it's a reminder of who we are and what we still can be in the beginning. The idea of freedom was more than a political slogan, it was a necessity, a lifeline pulled from centuries of oppression, taxation without representation, and monarchy that saw its people not as individuals, but as subjects. The foundation of the United States was born out of defiance, not for the sake of rebellion alone, but for the right to self-determination. When the Founding Fathers gathered in dimly lit rooms to draft declarations and constitutions, they were not merely creating laws, they were carving out a future shaped by the radical notion that individuals could govern themselves. This was not common sense in the world of empires and kings. It was a revolution of thought as much as action. The very concept that rights did not come from a ruler but from one's own humanity reshaped the contours of the Western world. Freedom was not just written into parchment, it was etched into the character of the people. From the earliest settlers who risked everything crossing oceans in wooden ships to escape religious persecution, to the rugged pioneers who pushed westward across a wild and unforgiving frontier, the spirit of liberty was woven into the American soul. These early Americans understood freedom not as luxury, but as the ground beneath their feet and the air in their lungs. They knew it as something worth working for, worth suffering for, and if need be, worth dying for. It was the catalyst that drove them forward, not toward comfort, but toward possibility. This foundation of freedom sparked the growth of a nation unlike any other. People were no longer constrained by birthright or social class. In the old world, your future was often dictated by your lineage, your title, or your allegiance. But in the new world, it was defined by your effort, your will, and your imagination. America became a place where ideas could flourish without the shadow of censorship, where entrepreneurs could risk everything on a dream, where religions could be practiced in peace, and where the value of a person was measured not by their surname, but by their contribution. This transformation did not happen overnight, and it did not happen without contradiction. The freedom that was declared in bold ink was not always delivered in full. Slavery, injustice, inequality all stood in direct opposition to the ideals set forth at the nation's birth. But even in those contradictions, the foundation of freedom endured, waiting to be claimed by every generation that followed. Freedom shaped the American character into something restless and resilient. It instilled a hunger that could not be fed by comfort or conformity. It created a people who questioned authority, challenged tradition, and believed that they were entitled not to success, but to the chance to pursue it. The freedom to speak your mind, to publish your thoughts, to gather in protest, to worship or not worship at all. These were not just principles on paper. They were lived truths, tested in every small town, courtroom, and ballot box across the nation. They were the tools by which ordinary people shaped extraordinary change. As America grew, so did its understanding of what freedom meant. It evolved, expanded, and deepened. What started as freedom from tyranny became freedom to dream, to innovate, to dissent, and to rise. It fueled revolutions not just in government, but in industry, art, science, and civil society. Children raised in the shadow of freedom learned not to ask for permission, but to ask, why not? They built engines and empires, wrote novels and symphonies, led movements, and broke barriers. From steel mills to Silicon Valleys, from cotton fields to college campuses, the foundation of freedom carried the weight of progress on its back. It was not just a set of rights, it was a mindset, a belief that the future was not handed down, but forged with calloused hands and determined hearts. That foundation gave every person a reason to stand tall, to speak up, and to strive. It told them they mattered and that no dream was too bold if it was pursued with purpose. That message echoed across centuries, passed from generation to generation, not just in classrooms and courtrooms, but at dinner tables and in whispered prayers. It was taught not by force, but by example, by the way Americans lived, failed, and kept trying. And through it all, freedom remained the cornerstone, the unshakable ground from which a dream could take root and reach for the sky. They came from every corner of the world, drawn not by riches, not by royalty, but by a whisper, sometimes carried only by letters, sometimes by stories passed down, sometimes by the desperate hope in a stranger's voice. They came with little more than the clothes on their backs and the fire in their hearts. The immigrant dream was not about ease, it was about opportunity. It was about the idea that in America, your beginning didn't have to dictate your end. That no matter where you were born, what your name sounded like, what God you worshipped, or how many coins you carried in your pocket, there was a place where effort could mean elevation, and dreams could be something more than fantasies. They walked across borders, sailed across oceans, and waited in lines that stretched for miles. Some arrived at Ellis Island and looked up at a statue that promised refuge. Others crossed deserts and mountains with nothing but a photograph and the memory of someone who once made it. They endured hunger, discrimination, and the weight of starting over in a place where they were often unwelcome. But they endured because they believed. They believed in the promise that freedom offered, a freedom that said you were no longer bound by the chains of caste or the ceiling of class. In America, you could be more than what the world had told you to be. Their hands built the cities, their sweat laid the railroads, their ideas filled the classrooms, and their voices began to shape the very culture of the country. From the bustling streets of New York to the farm fields of the Midwest, from the ports of San Francisco to the factories of Detroit, immigrants didn't just contribute to America, they transformed it. They brought with them languages, music, food, traditions, and stories that wove into the fabric of a nation, becoming ever more vibrant and alive. But beyond the cultural gifts, they brought something even more precious, the unshakable belief in the future. For many, America was not a place they had ever seen with their own eyes until they arrived, but it had lived in their imaginations long before their feet touched its soil. The dream they chased was not handed to them, it was earned. Through long hours, back-breaking work, silent perseverance, and the courage to keep going when every door seemed closed, they faced suspicion, were labeled outsiders, and sometimes were asked to prove their worth again and again. But in spite of this, they persisted, not just for themselves, but for their children, because the American dream, to them, was not only about building a better life, but building a better life for the next generation. It was the dream of watching a daughter walk across a graduation stage or seeing a son open a shop with the family name on the door. It was the quiet pride in knowing that the sacrifices made in the past were planting seeds for something greater in the future. Freedom was the fuel for that dream. It gave people the space to imagine a life beyond survival, a life with purpose, dignity, and possibility. In places where speaking your mind could cost your life, they found a land where speech was protected. In places where your religion was banned or your culture erased, they found neighborhoods where they could gather, celebrate, and be themselves. In places where a child's life was mapped out before they could speak, they found schools where curiosity was nurtured and ambition was welcomed. Freedom was not perfect in its delivery, and often those very immigrants had to fight to be recognized as equal participants in the American story, but the idea was powerful enough to make the fight worth it. Even in the face of hardship, the immigrant dream never faded. It grew stronger with each generation. It echoed in kitchens where grandmothers cooked meals from old homelands, while children at the table spoke English with dreams of medicine, law, art, and science. It rang in the halls of universities where first-generation students wrote their names into history. It marched in the streets when rights were denied and celebrated in parades when victories were won. This dream, born in the heart of freedom, created a cycle of hope that passed from parent to child like a treasured heirloom. And every new arrival, whether yesterday or centuries ago, added another verse to the ongoing song of what it means to come here not just to live, but to dream. In a world where limitation was once the norm and ceilings were carved into the very structure of society, American freedom tore open the skies and gave birth to something rare, unrestricted innovation. Freedom did not just protect speech or belief. It liberated thought itself. It allowed ideas to be pursued without fear, without suppression, without the cold grip of censorship that once stifled minds across the oceans. In America, the mind was not a prisoner of tradition or tyranny. It was a compass, a tool, a spark, and when people were no longer told what to think, they began to ask the questions that would change the course of history. It began with invention, with hands stained by grease and minds bursting with curiosity. The right to tinker, to fail, to test, to rebuild, these were not just granted, they were celebrated. In barns and basements, garages and workshops, people dared to reimagine the possible. A young man with a kite and a key sparked a fascination with electricity that would later light up a continent. Two brothers in Ohio watched birds fly and believed man could do the same. They had no title, no funding, no blueprint, but the sky and the faith in their own minds. It was freedom that allowed them to chase wind and gravity, to fail time and again, without punishment or exile, and eventually to rise, literally. With each new era, American innovation became the signature of its freedom. From the Industrial Revolution to the digital age, the ability to explore uncharted territory was never confined to labs or lecture halls. It lived in the spirit of ordinary people with extraordinary imaginations. Entrepreneurs who saw not only what was, but what could be. Scientists who dared to challenge the laws of nature. Artists who used their freedom to paint, write, film, and perform visions the world had never seen before. That was the gift of the American spirit, to question without fear, to explore without boundaries, and to believe that even the most impossible idea could become reality. Nowhere was this more evident than in the race to the stars. What began as a Cold War competition became the purest example of how far freedom could reach. With courage and calculation, a nation driven by possibility launched not only rockets but dreams into the heavens. It wasn't just about reaching the moon. It was about proving that no frontier was final. That same courage pushed engineers to build machines that could compute faster, think smarter, and change the way the world communicates. It pushed doctors to challenge death itself, to develop cures, transplants, and therapies that gave new life where once there was none. Innovation wasn't limited to technology. It reshaped every corner of American life. It changed how people lived, worked, learned, and loved. It made information faster, work more productive, and ideas more accessible. From the typewriter to the microchip, from assembly lines to artificial intelligence, each leap forward was born in a place where the mind could roam freely. That freedom was the engine, and innovation was the movement. The policies, the protections, the cultural encouragement, it all created an ecosystem where the bold were rewarded, where failure wasn't fatal but formative. Even beyond industry and invention, freedom unlocked human creativity on a level never seen before. Music moved from street corners to symphonies. Film turned from novelty to narrative. Books banned in other nations became bestsellers in the land of the free. Voices that were silenced elsewhere found microphones here. Dancers, designers, architects, and coders all found space to breathe and room to grow. And the diversity of thought, born from the diversity of people, only added to the strength of that innovation. Because in America, creativity was not one size fits all. It came in every accent, every tone, every color, and every story. The true power of innovation unleashed by freedom is not just in the product, but in the process. The right to question, to doubt, to challenge authority, even scientific authority, allowed every generation to build on the one before it. It created a mindset where limits were temporary and problems were puzzles, not prisons. A mindset where a child in a public school could dream of solving climate change or creating the next great technology and actually have a path to do it. That mindset was contagious. It spread from city to city, from coast to coast, from person to person, until it became part of the American identity itself. Not just the land of the free, but the land of the forward-thinking. The place where possibility lived not in the hands of a few, but in the hearts of the many. There are moments in history when the most powerful change does not come from the top, but from the streets, from church pews, from classrooms, from kitchen tables, where voices once quiet begin to rise. In America, freedom gave those voices a place to be heard, even when the world tried to silence them. It was freedom that allowed the oppressed not only to speak, but to organize, to march, to protest, to demand. That right to dissent became the heartbeat of progress, and through it, voices of change began to echo louder than ever before. The fight for civil rights was not just about laws, it was about dignity. It was about a people long denied their share of the American promise, standing up and saying, enough. In other parts of the world, such defiance would have been crushed by force, drowned in silence. But in America, even when resistance met fire hoses and fists, freedom gave the movement its footing. It allowed songs to be sung in the streets, signs to be raised in defiance, and speeches to be delivered not in hiding, but in broad daylight. It allowed a preacher from Atlanta to speak of a dream not just for himself, but for a nation whose soul had not yet caught up to its ideals. And it wasn't just one group or one decade. Freedom gave women the space to demand equality in places that long denied them entry. From the right to vote to the right to lead, the movement for women's rights was built on the ability to challenge injustice without fear of vanishing. It was not always welcomed and it was not always safe, but American freedom meant that even in the face of resistance, those voices had a place to stand and a way to be seen. They marched in suffrage parades, they spoke on courthouse steps, they demanded representation in a world built to keep them quiet, and freedom kept the door open long enough for them to push through. Each generation found its own cause, its own battle to fight under the banner of freedom. Laborers stood together and asked for safer conditions, fair wages, and dignity in their work. Students raised their voices against war and injustice, not in hushed corners, but in mass gatherings that captured the nation's attention. Immigrant communities demanded to be seen not as threats, but as part of the American story. And through it all, freedom protected the right to challenge the status quo. Change did not come easily. It came with blood, with jail cells, with heartbreak. But it came. Because no matter how heavy the resistance, the power of a free people is in their persistence. It is in the ability to look power in the face and say, "You are wrong," and to say it without fear of vanishing into the night. That is what made the American voice so different. It was not granted only to the powerful or the elite. It was available to anyone with the will to use it. From rural farmers to urban activists, from teachers to students, from veterans to newcomers, everyone had the right to stand, to speak, and to shape their future. The movements that changed America were born not only of frustration, but of possibility. Because freedom gave people not only the right to be angry, it gave them the tools to do something about it. They could organize, write, vote, gather, build coalitions, run for office, and create change not from the sidelines, but from within the very system that had once excluded them. That transformation of the outsider becoming the architect was made possible by a structure that, while flawed, allowed space for correction. Freedom made reform not a hope, but a reality. Those who raised their voices did so not only for themselves, but for those who would follow. They understood that every inch gained today could be a mile walked tomorrow by someone else. They knew that protest was not a sign of hatred for a nation, but a profound belief in what that nation could be. They believed that criticism in a free society was not betrayal, but a duty, and that belief made them powerful. As the decades passed, the faces and causes changed, but the rhythm of progress remained steady. Each struggle, whether for civil rights, gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, or social justice, was carried forward by people who knew the system could be challenged from within. They understood that freedom was not only a shield, it was a sword not of violence, but of truth, of resilience, of collective purpose. That sword was wielded by voices sharpened through hardship, polished by hope, and unleashed in every courtroom, on every ballot, in every peaceful demonstration where someone stood and said, "This is not yet right, but it can be." Walk through any town in America and listen. Listen closely. You'll hear it in the laughter of children running across playgrounds, in the debates unfolding in classrooms, in the songs blasting from car stereos, and in the quiet determination of workers opening shops before sunrise. You'll hear it in the ambition of a teenager with a sketchbook full of dreams, in the calm authority of a teacher changing lives one student at a time, in the click of a keyboard as an idea becomes a plan. That sound, that feeling, that invisible force humming beneath the surface of everyday life, it's the legacy of freedom. A legacy that has never been perfect, never been complete, but one that still moves through this country like a current, powering the next generation of dreamers. That legacy lives in the stories handed down across dinner tables, in the reminders of ancestors who once had nothing but a suitcase and a hope, in the memories of fights fought not on battlefields, but in voting booths, courtrooms, and peaceful marches. Children grow up hearing about how their grandparents worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, how their mothers studied late into the night, how their fathers built something from nothing. They grow up knowing that sacrifice was not the end of the story. It was the beginning, that what was earned in one generation was never meant to be hoarded, but passed down like a torch. And each generation, when handed that torch, is faced with a choice. Do they carry it forward? Do they protect that flame of possibility and push it farther into the darkness of the unknown? For millions of young people across this country, the answer has always been yes. Not because they were told to, but because they understood. They understood that freedom didn't just open doors. It created architects, inventors, activists, and explorers who dreamed of entire cities that had never been built, ideas that had never been tested, rights that had never been fully realized. The legacy of freedom is found in the courage to say I can when the world whispers you can't. It's in the first-generation college student walking into a lecture hall that no one in their family ever thought they'd see. It's in the girl from a rural town dreaming of being a surgeon, the boy in a crowded neighborhood believing he can change the world through code or music or law. It's in the refugee who steps onto American soil, not just for shelter, but for the promise that their children will grow up believing they are limitless. It's found in the innovations still being born, in the startups turning dreams into jobs, in the artists breaking molds and the athletes defying odds. It's in the endless cycle of dreaming, trying, failing, and trying again. Because freedom never promised ease, it promised the opportunity to try. It didn't promise success, but it promised the right to chase it, to shape it, to define it for yourself. The legacy echoes in how this country argues with itself, in the loud, messy, beautiful chorus of disagreement that can only exist when people are free to speak their minds. In the way Americans fight not because they hate their country, but because they believe it can be better. That belief is not weakness, it's strength. And it comes from knowing that progress doesn't erase the past, but builds upon it, brick by brick, word by word, voice by voice. You'll see it in classrooms where students debate big questions without fear. You'll see it in neighborhoods where people organize food drives, town halls, and art festivals that celebrate every culture woven into the American fabric. You'll see it in the ballot boxes where people line up because they believe their voice still matters. And you'll see it in the quiet, private spaces, too, in journals, in prayers, in late-night emails from someone starting something new. Freedom's legacy is a living thing. It moves through stories, through struggles, through song and silence. It lives in the contradictions, in the tension between what is and what could be. And the greatest testament to that legacy is that it continues to evolve. It doesn't rest. It adapts to the world as it changes, shaping new paths for people who never thought they'd have a seat at the table. It gives permission to the overlooked, the underestimated to rise. The next generation doesn't have to be told what freedom means. They already know. They feel it in the choices they make, in the ambitions they carry, in the risks they're willing to take. They inherit more than history. They inherit possibility. And that inheritance, that unspoken promise written between the lines of every story, every struggle, every sacrifice, is what keeps the dream alive.